Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Professor Iseult Lynch from the University of Birmingham, and welcome to this webinar as part of the Royal Society of Chemistries series discussing the chemistry and climate change as we look forward to COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference in November. For nearly 3 decades, the United Nations have been bringing together people from almost every country on Earth for global climate summits. As you'd expect, the Royal Society of Chemistry will be showing how chemistry is vital for understanding and tackling climate change through this series of online events. We will be recording this session and all our panels for those not able to join in real time. Please do see the rest of our programme on our website by going to rsc.li/COP26. Today, I'm pleased to welcome an expert panel to discuss the climate impacts of agriculture and how the chemical sciences help us to understand this. Although carbon dioxide from our energy systems is the largest human influence on the climate, agriculture is responsible for nearly 1/4 of greenhouse gas pollution. As well as altering carbon flows to and from the land, agriculture also emits methane and nitrous oxide, which have very different chemistries in their origin and fate. They are also considered to be very difficult to mitigate in comparison to eliminating fossil fuel emissions. This panel will summarise our understanding of this global issue, the agricultural sources of greenhouse gases, what can be done to address them, and where further research is needed. We will have time for some questions and answers at the end, so please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A tab, which you should be able to find on the bottom bar of the Zoom screen. So, first of all, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Michelle Cain, who is a lecturer in environmental analytics in the Centre for Environmental and Agricultural Informatics at Cranfield University. Her current research focuses on the role of greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide in limiting global warming, consistent with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. In particular, she looks at how to estimate the temperature outcomes from reducing methane emissions, and that's what she's going to talk to us about today. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll just get my slides all sorted. So thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about methane and agriculture, just a very brief overview, and happy to talk to answer questions later. So to start with, I thought I'd just show broadly methane's impact on the climate. So not specifically agricultural methane, but all methane emissions from anthropogenic sources. So this figure is from the recent IPCC assessment report, the 6th assessment report, Working Group 1. And it's a really nice summary figure that shows the contributions of all the different greenhouse gases and aerosols on the temperature, on global warming. So the bars are showing how much warming is contributed by each of the gases. And you can see methane, where I've highlighted in yellow, is the second most important greenhouse gas for global warming. So anthropogenic methane emissions have raised global temperature by about 1/2 degree already. And so this is a key greenhouse gas to address for the Paris Agreement, but it's not as a bigger contributor as CO2. And there's another very big difference between them, which is the lifetime. So CO2, carbon dioxide, is an extremely long-lived greenhouse gas. Once you've emitted CO2, it basically stays in the climate system for centuries, and if not millennia. Whereas methane has a half-life of around a decade. So roughly speaking, if you emit a ton of methane, after about a decade, about half of it will have been destroyed through chemical reactions. And that's reactions with the OH radical primarily, but also some chlorine radicals. And a few other source sinks. So cutting methane emissions, you can see from that short lifetime effect that you can infer from that cutting methane emissions will actually very rapidly have the power to lower the amount of methane in the atmosphere. And so if we cut our methane emissions, then that means we'll be cutting the amount of methane in the atmosphere and therefore its contribution to global warming. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this for this particular audience. I think this is a really nice way of looking at these lifetime effects. So this is a paper from Solomon et al. In 2010, and I find this is the most intuitive way of thinking about how these lifetimes impact on the climate. So this is a really simple experiment where they've run a climate model with a standard emission scenario up to 2050, and then abruptly they've just stopped all emissions. Okay, so they've stopped all the greenhouse gas emissions and then looked at what happens. So for CO2 in the top panel, the warming from the CO2 emissions is in red, and then the radiative forcing, which is the perturbation to the energy balance of the climate system, is in solid black, and then the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is the dashed line. So you can see even after CO2 emissions completely stop, the temperature impact remains relatively the same for the whole simulation up to 2200. So this is 150 years later, you've still got that elevated temperature, and the blue shading I've added on is half. So the y-axis here is normalized to 1 at 2050. So even after 150 years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere hasn't even halved after the emissions cease. Nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas that's emitted through agriculture, after about 150 years, the temperature implications of those emissions have roughly halved. So the lifetime of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere is over 100 years. So you can see that fits after just over 100 years, the temperature implications have halved, and in fact, after about 100 years, approximately, the amount of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere is halved. And then methane, with a much shorter lifetime, you can see has much more rapid impact. So cutting off methane emissions leads to about the temperature impact for methane halving in about 20 years. So it's a very rapid lever, some people describe it as, for climate change, for tackling climate change. And so the key thing to take home, I think, from this is that if we want to stabilise, so to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, we need to, at minimum, stabilise the temperature, global temperatures. We may, if we overshoot beyond 2 degrees, or even at 2 degrees, we'll have to reduce temperatures again. So we need to get CO2 emissions at a minimum to net zero, but we might actually have to go below net zero and be net negative. For methane, we don't need to get to net zero emissions to stabilise the temperature, or even to reduce the temperature, but it does provide an opportunity to do more towards these temperature goals. So onto methane in particular. This is from the Global Carbon Project, where they've looked at the global methane budget, so assessed all the literature sources and sinks of methane. The red ones are anthropogenic, and the green ones are natural. And you see agriculture, which we're talking about today, it is lumped in there with waste, and it's the largest single, the agricultural waste arrow is the largest single combined source. So I don't really have time to talk about this in detail, but this is a great resource, the global methane budget, if you want to look at methane emissions. So the key thing with this, I think, is that the red rectangle there says the methane atmospheric growth rate is 10. I mean, that just means that the amount of methane remaining in the atmosphere is going up over time at the moment, quite rapidly. So the sources are outweighing the sinks, and we really need to reverse that if we want to get the warming from methane to reduce. So from agriculture, this is just another way of looking at the same data, basically. So the grey bar in the first pie chart is agriculture, and what are the sources within agriculture? Well, the biggest single source is enteric fermentation, and so that's from ruminant animals, so cattle, sheep, and it's to do with how they digest food. So there's microbes within the gut, within the rumen, which produce methane as a byproduct, and so there's not really any way you can absolutely eradicate that. The other larger slice of the pie there is rice cultivation, so paddy fields, and that is a source of both methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And we've got manure management, again, that's a source for methane shown here, but also nitrous oxide, and that's from all types of animals. So those are the key methane sources. This is just showing the same kind of data a bit differently. So this is from 1990 to nearly the present day. World methane emissions divided by sector. So globally, agriculture is the largest sector that produces methane emissions. If we look at the UK only, you can see there's quite a different picture actually, because in the past we had much higher waste emissions, but that's come down dramatically over the last couple of decades. So waste being landfill sites and waste management. But so that means that at the present time, agriculture is the biggest single source of methane emissions in the UK, about 1 million tonnes of methane from the national inventory. And the government has, so recently in the news, there was an announcement from the EU, and the UK was also agreeing with it to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030 on 2020 levels. So, you know, when you're looking at that, that's quite a reduction in quite a small space of time. And so clearly, if you were to look at the UK emissions, how we're going to reduce to by 30%, given agriculture is the largest single sector, it would need to provide some reductions if we're going to achieve that, I think, practically. So I just wanted to finish with, this is a slightly complicated figure, but I didn't have time to lead into it gently, but just wanted to talk about how much methane could have a role towards achieving Paris Agreement temperature goals. And so the thing that I wanted to show with this is it's showing 2020, so temperature contributions relative to 2020. There are different greenhouse gases, but I wanted to focus on the methane examples. So the yellow, the green, sorry, the yellow, the blue and the pink are showing 3 different methane futures. So we've started at the present day with our historical emissions, and then we said, okay, relative to today, what are these different greenhouse gases contributing towards future warming relative to today? And so there's 3 different scenarios for methane. The first one is where we've left the radiative forcing constant at today's level. And in fact, that gives rise to a small increase in temperature of 0.08 degrees by the end of the century. So that's the yellow, due to the inertia in the climate system. And then in a set of scenarios, the median scenario reduced methane emissions by 60% by 2100. And if you run that through the model, that gives you 0.14 degrees C of cooling, effectively. It reduces temperatures relative to 2020 by that amount. And in a maximum ambition scenario where we reduced emissions by 88%, that was 0.24 degrees lower than today's levels. So that's the kind of level of temperature benefits you could be getting if you globally reduce methane emissions by these kind of amounts. So I'll just finish on there just to summarise that reducing methane emissions leads to temperature decreases in a few decades if you reduce them enough. Net zero methane emissions are not required to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals like they are for long-lived gases like CO2. So reduced emissions, okay, I might have missed out a few words there on my slide, but reduced emissions, what I mean is reduced emissions are required for the Paris Agreement. Really, we do need to reduce methane emissions because currently emissions are increasing. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That was fantastic and really, really informative, and definitely a great plug for how we can go about beginning to tackle the emissions from agriculture. Please do stay with us through the webinar, because we'll have a discussion session at the end. And just a reminder for our audience, you are able to ask some questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom. We will be saving those for the broader discussion, but please do add them in, as you think of them. Next up, our second speaker is Professor Joann Whalen, who is the James McGill Professor at McGill University and also an adjunct professor with the Northeast Institute of Geography and Agroecology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Professor Whalen was elected as the president of the American Society of Agronomy in 2021, and her research focuses on soil fertility and soil ecological health of agroecosystems. She's going to tell us more about nutrient cycling and its implications for climate change. Over to you, Joann.
Thanks so much, Iseult. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and present to everyone today. So I will tell you a little story about how we manage nutrients in soil and in particular in agricultural systems and what the implications of this are for climate change. So we know that in agriculture, we are influencing and changing nitrogen levels and all of the nutrient cycling in soils. And we do this very purposefully because nitrogen and other nutrients are absolutely essential for modern crop production. All we need to do is look at any of the hundreds or perhaps thousands, even tens of thousands of fertilizer response curves, this one being for corn, to know that adding nitrogen fertilizer will improve the grain yield of that crop. And it shows up as very visual when we do make a picture of the corn and seeing that when we add no nitrogen fertilizer, we don't produce much. And as we get up to an optimum level, we reach the level of grain production that we should get off the field. For farmers, the issue is one of efficiency and economics. They are going to be driving machinery across the field to plant, manage, and harvest a crop. And so their goal for an economic perspective is that if I can have is an optimum yield or a top yield, even some people would call it a maximum yield, then I have been more efficient and I have more returns, therefore lowering cost of production. The thing is, when we are growing these top level crops, it does have certain benefits to the soil because when we produce a high yielding quality crop, we produce a food supply for animals and people. And at the same time, those crops grow very well. So they fix more CO2 and they will shunt more carbon below the ground to contribute to the soil organic matter. But the problem that we have to deal with is how to manage the nitrogen and the other nutrients. And we know that the nitrogen use in agricultural systems is extremely high. There's nearly 100 million tons of nitrogen per year in the form of inorganic fertilizers, such as urea, which is shown here in the picture, that is applied to agricultural systems for crop production. And that's about 50% of the global nitrogen input to agroecosystems. I can't neglect to tell you that there are some other nitrogen inputs. Manure from animals and crop residues are recycled in agricultural systems. There's also biological nitrogen fixation, which is the process of N2 from the atmosphere being transformed through the action of microorganisms that possess a nitrogen reductase enzyme and can convert that into ammonia-based compounds that then can be absorbed and used by plants. Furthermore, there's atmospheric deposition and sedimentation due to the redistribution of nitrogen from gaseous and particulate forms that enters agricultural systems. Regardless of the fact that we have lots of nitrogen circulating around in our agricultural systems, we're always faced with a difficult problem of trying to get the fertilizer into a dissolved plant available form that can be absorbed through the specific nitrogen transporter systems in the roots of plants, because plants have to have an ionic form, normally ammonium or nitrate. They have some capacity to take small quantities of amino acids. Small amino acids can be absorbed too, but the primary forms of nitrogen that are absorbed by plant roots are the ammonium and nitrate form. And plants have a certain efficiency for this. Their efficiency might be quite variable. It can range anywhere from 20 to 80%, with a global average of about 60%. An average of 60% nitrogen use efficiency means that 40% of it is gone someplace. So what happens to it is an interesting question. If I make the graph a little bit more complicated, and I put in the other sources of nitrogen, atmospheric deposition, manures, crop residues, biological nitrogen fixation, and we look again at that nitrogen use efficiency, a further report in 2014 had estimated that it's only about 47%. Well, that means that less than half of the nitrogen coming into the agricultural system is possibly used by the plant, meaning that about 50% or more of the nitrogen we apply to agricultural systems is leaving or is going someplace else. So some of it could be fixed in the soil, it could be retained in some organo-mineral complex, but the worry and the concern that we have is that nitrogen is very susceptible and vulnerable to be converted into some types of gaseous or dissolved forms, and so it tends to leave the agricultural system. And one of those forms that we're very interested in, we're very concerned about indeed, from the perspective of climate change, is the nitrous oxide emissions. The nitrous oxide emissions are very much dependent on having a nitrogen excess. So you can see from this study that was published in 2018, the nitrous oxide fluxes on the y-axis in relationship to the date, the calendar date on the x-axis, and showing that the fluxes in this particular corn, soybean agroecosystems from the North China Plain were almost always occurring just after the nitrogen fertilizer was applied. Because the practice in the North China Plain was you apply nitrogen fertilizer. In the summer months, it's quite dry, so you will put some irrigation water in to dissolve the fertilizer, and in doing so, you now have too much ammonium and nitrate beyond what the plant can use. And so therefore, it is vulnerable to undergo other chemical and biochemical reactions that release the N2O. That's a very clean story. There's other variables that can be involved, but it gives you a sense. And we do know that nitrogen fertilizer application is very much correlated with the N2O emissions from agricultural systems. It is so well known that N2O is coming from agricultural soils that when we look at the global view, and this is the N2O emissions in the United States, we see that at least almost 3/4 of all the N2O emissions are coming directly from the agricultural soils. So we have the issue in agriculture of being tasked with the goal of being very careful with our fertilizer inputs, because we know they're very vulnerable to be transformed into this N2O. And as Michelle had reminded us, that nitrous oxide, once it leaves the agricultural system, has a very long half-life of about 150 years in the atmosphere. And furthermore, it has an extremely high global warming potential. Its radiative force is 310 times that of CO2. So it's quite worrisome. But it's not just what comes out of the field in the direct emissions. The second thing is that when water might drain out of the field and you have nitrate that leaves the field in a dissolved form, it's vulnerable to enter into waterways and undergo a whole series of reactions. A number of them are mentioned there. Most are biologically mediated, but there's a number of reactions such as nitrification, denitrification, autotrophic nitrification, nitrifier denitrification, complete denitrification, and so on, that will cause the N2O to be indirectly emitted from the waterway that's downstream from the field. And it's not just nitrogen and nitrous oxide that we have to be concerned about. I want to remind you that there's another issue. In addition to the very pressing and concerning climate change issues, there are major water quality issues because the nutrient runoff from well-fertilized fields contributes directly to the eutrophication of ponds, lakes, and rivers. And that type of nutrient excess flowing into our surface water supports the unparalleled growth of the cyanobacteria, which are a very old phylogenetic group on the Earth. And we're terribly concerned about this because of the toxins produced by these cyanobacteria blooms. They're very, very often limited by phosphorus, but nitrogen also contributes to their growth and to their ability to produce toxins. And let me just give you some examples of these natural toxins that are very dangerous to humans, such as microcystins, a cyclic peptide that's hepatotoxic to fish and mammals. It kills plants too. It bioaccumulates in plants. There's endotoxin A that causes respiratory failure in mammals. Cylindrus spermosin, which is hepatotoxic and also damages the kidneys. Saxitoxin, which causes paralysis and respiratory failure. And finally, a very new emerging cyanotoxin called BMAA, or beta-methylaminoalanine, which is an amino acid. It's a non-proteogenic amino acid that's linked to a whole series of human neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. And so these substances being produced in the water is quite concerning to us. This is the reason that if ever you should see a beach where it's closed down, do take quite good notice, and for heaven's sakes, please keep your dogs out. We unfortunately encountered a few dogs that had suffered a neurological damage from going into waters in which they had been exposed to these types of algal blooms. And so we should be quite cautious indeed. And we know from our own work in agricultural systems that the concentrations of phosphorus that can be leaving the field in surface runoff and in tile drainage could be in the order of, for the surface runoff, it was as high as about 3,181 micrograms of phosphorus per liter. In the tile drainage, it was up to 1,346 micrograms of phosphorus in the tile drainage. And I just remind you that this is 2 orders of magnitude above the water quality standard here in Canada, which I suspect is similar to the water quality standard in many other jurisdictions as well. So what we should do, we're very cognizant of these risks, of these issues. And so our approach in agriculture is to make sure that the nitrogen and other nutrients are applied to grow crops. Indeed, that they should be applied to meet the crop requirements with no excesses. So whatever we put on the field should be put cautiously, prudently, and judiciously. We use the 4R approach, meaning that we carefully select the sources, rates, timing, and place to put fertilizer, which is what we call the 4R practices for fertilizer use. And we combine this with conservation practices that should be aiming to improve the yield, soil health, water quality, and at the same time also reduce the N2O. So the normal practice that we have now in agriculture should be the best things that we're doing to try to help out. But I just want to give you one last notion. One last notion is that there's still quite a lot of soil biology underneath all of this that we're still trying to understand, of how the microbes are responding to things like our conservation practices, where we want to use more organic residues, we want to use more animal manures and excretia. We look in my research group at things like the transfer of organic residues through soil fauna like earthworms that are responsible for fragmenting those materials and passing them over to the microbial community, which provides some nitrogen that can go to crops. If we can understand the supply of nutrients that occurs naturally, we hope that we can be a little better at modifying and adjusting and calibrating our fertilizer applications to try to control and reduce the N2O emissions from soil. So that's our goal. Thank you so much. Look forward to any questions you may have.
Super. Thank you very much, Joann. That was absolutely fascinating whistle-stop tour of the sorts of, and the breadth and diversity of your research and the big questions that your group are tackling. Please stay with us for our Q&A as well. Our third speaker today is Professor Mark Sutton of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and Edinburgh University. His research has focused primarily on the emission, behaviour and fate of ammonia in the atmosphere. His work spans a wide range of disciplines, from micrometeorology and atmospheric chemistry to plant ecology and policy analysis. Since 2012, Professor Sutton has been working with the United Nations Environment Programme, supporting their work through the Global Programme of Action on the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities. This led to his spearheading of the International Nitrogen Management System as a developing mechanism of science support for the emerging nitrogen policy arena. He's here today to talk to us about Nitrogen for Net Zero initiative. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me just get the screen up and tell me in a moment whether you can see this okay.
I can see it, yes.
Okay, 2 seconds. Okay, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the planet today. So nitrogen for net zero is pretty obvious. It's about nitrogen and climate, and what's the role of nitrogen in climate management, both mitigation and adaptation. And I think the presentations from Michelle and Joann have really set this up nicely, showing issues about long-time lifespan of N2O in the atmosphere, of agricultural management measures. And what I'm going to do here is to put that, let's say, in a wider context of going from science to policy engagement. And you can see there are a flurry of acronyms of the different processes we're involved with: the International Nitrogen Management System, INMS, supported by UNEP and Jeff, and also working with South Asia through the UKRI Global Challenges Research Fund, a nitrogen hub. So this is going to be my summary of the talk in one slide. And let's see how quickly I can summarize it. Why nitrogen for climate action? So it's clear climate action mitigation starts with the carbon cycle. But we've got to include nitrous oxide. There's no question about that. That's been made clear already by Michelle. But we would argue that successful action to reduce nitrous oxide emissions requires a transformation of the whole global nitrogen cycle. A few bolt-on technical measures will not do the job of ambitious mitigation, and we need to transform the nitrogen cycle. And when doing that, that then means that there are multiple win-wins for climate, environment, health, and economy. And as Joann has emphasized, some of those water issues, I will also emphasize air quality issues, biodiversity benefits, and economic, given the cost of that nitrogen. So that's our mission. And just to remember the different forms: dinitrogen, 78% of every breath we take, a very stable triple bond, means that it's not doing much other than giving stability to the atmosphere. Ammonia, nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide are the classic NOx together, urban air pollution, but also coming out of soils. And as emissions from combustion sources are reduced, that share from agricultural soils is getting bigger. Nitrates, of course, and nitrous oxide as a warming gas. I keep that really simple, but essentially there are hundreds, thousands of other organic nitrogen compounds on the list. Every DNA molecule is a nitrogen compound, and of course, everyone is different. Onto the cascade, and we talk about a nitrogen cascade that links these different inputs. So let's start with the fertilizer manufacture and the crop biological nitrogen fixation to grow crops. And these are the different gases and pollutants coming out of the system. But I want to emphasize very clearly the livestock farming part. We've shown that globally, 80% of the nitrogen that's going into agricultural systems is actually going to feed livestock rather than people. That's a really powerful number. So it's not just about food security, it's about feed security and how much livestock we want to have on the planet. High temperature combustion sources add into these different emissions. And then, of course, it starts reacting ammonia and nitrate in rain, particulate matter going down the rivers. The ecosystems become saturated until finally it's a cascade of energy dissipation. It's finally denitrified back to N2. So you can do that energy dissipation of reactive nitrogen slowly, like this diagram. You can also do it very fast. An explosion of a nitrogen explosive, that detonation is immediate conversion of reactive nitrogen compounds back to N2. So that illustrates the energy dissipation that's going on here, being used by microbes and other organisms. And there's a flurry of different impacts of nitrogen, climate being one of them. but also those other issues, stratospheric ozone loss, nitrous oxide now the major source of stratospheric ozone depletion, urban air quality. Tropospheric ozone, in the air we breathe, ozone is an honorary nitrogen compound because it's formed by nitrogen oxides and volatile organic matter. The particulate matter in the air we breathe, the ecosystems, the water. This is a multi-dimensional problem. And with that, now, Joann was just emphasizing maybe 50% loss from arable systems, but if you look at the full chain of the animal and the livestock, not just the arable systems, something like 80% of the reactive nitrogen resources are in the end wasted. Now, we've done some analysis in the European nitrogen assessment on the effect of the warming and cooling aspects of nitrogen. This is a somewhat old diagram, and although I did it, I'm going to update it and say I think the perspective is slightly wrong in our own diagram. Because what we identified before was there warming aspects of nitrogen, the nitrous oxide. There's another warming aspect to the effect on tropospheric ozone. And then we've got cooling effects as nitrogen emissions to the atmosphere come back down, land on forests, make the forests grow more and absorb more carbon from the atmosphere, the cooling aspect. The particulate matter, the ammonium and nitrate in air is also having a cooling effect. So you could say, well, the cooling is slightly bigger than the warming. Actually, that's not significantly different between the two. The problem is these are the costs, and each of those have got massive costs. And actually, the biggest of all of those costs in terms of willingness to pay is the effect on particulate matter. These are estimates for Europe, in the European Union, from the European Nitrogen Assessment. That means that we have to reduce that particulate air pollution. Also, the biodiversity impacts, we have to reduce those biodiversity impacts. And too much nitrogen is actually bad anyway. So let's say that these are the penalty where we have to take action, but taking action will warm. And these are the actions where there'll be cooling benefits. But the net result is actually we need to add them, not subtract the two. That means taking action on nitrogen is doubly important if we're going to meet those multiple goals. I want now to talk about some evolving narratives and just keep it really simple, because a few years ago we were talking about reducing nitrogen pollutants, fragmentation across nitrogen forms. A nitrous oxide scientist would typically not talk to an ammonia scientist. We've all got enough to do without talking to each other. And that was missing critical synergies that can motivate action, both in science and in the policy. I think we've moved forward from that towards a more narrative on increasing nitrogen efficiency. It's a positive approach where we're looking towards economy-wide potential to improve efficiency. The problem is it's actually hard to set shared goals. If you want everybody improved by 20%, that means those with a higher efficiency have to do more than those on a lower efficiency. But nevertheless, it's got some positives. And this, I think, is where we're at now, is reducing wasted nitrogen resources. And here we've introduced the term, not of solid waste, municipal solid waste, but a different concept of wasted nitrogen resources. And by that, we mean the sum of all nitrogen losses to the environment. And that includes denitrification to N2, because that's equally a waste of resources. We're finding that a positive approach. It's allowing more equitable shared goals. Of course, it's fostering the circular economy. If you have no wasted nitrogen resources, then you have no action. But of course, as Joann has shown you, there are a huge fraction that is wasted, and there's a lot for people to do. But let's say you can't object to reducing waste, and therefore that improves, let's say, working together. What we haven't done is said reduce nitrogen inputs. We find that narrative is not very helpful. It instantly finds opponents, but turn it the other way around. If we reduce the wasted amount of nitrogen, the net result is what we have is going further, and we don't need so much input. Looking forward, that we have a goal to halve nitrogen waste in the Colombo Declaration agreed in 2019. Actually, that's an ambition rather than a commitment, but it's setting the way forward to say, what would we do? And this graph frames it in terms of the economic value of the nitrogen loss. This is not the human health impacts. This is just purely the financial fertilizer value of those nitrogen pollution from farming systems, which are dominating. That's the bottom part. And the top part is the nitrogen oxides combustion. You can see all there the various conventions going forward. And we've got a huge challenge ahead if we are going to turn that around. At the moment, what we're looking at is improving definitions, being clear about what that is, reference year, relationship to net zero, ambition for COP. And, you know, at the moment, COP26 is going to provide an opportunity for further views for countries to guide on this way forward. Just to come in terms of innovation, our message is that agriculture is, of course, number one place for action on better nitrogen management, but it's not just about agriculture. It's every part of society needs to play a role. So it's not pointing the finger at anybody in particular, but saying we must all work together towards this nitrogen circular economy. In terms of agricultural management, we recently launched a document. You can see the reference number there, ECE-EB Air 149. If you type that into Google, you'll very quickly get a document with 24 principles, 76 specific measures. And here you can see a selection of these different measures as I scroll down. And what we've done is highlighted how certain measures are better for ammonia or nitrous oxide or nitrate, or provide win-wins all around. So let's finish in terms of going forward. What we're doing is raising awareness, bring science to the table with policymakers. We're having a discussion, particularly with Sri Lanka taking the lead globally at present. And here's a comments from the president of Sri Lanka. I believe it's important to address the issue of nitrogen waste in a similarly urgent way to carbon dioxide and to broaden the ongoing discourse on climate change. And we're currently working towards an event on the 31st of October in the wings of COP26. Just Google nitrogen for net zero and you can go online for this streaming event. We'll also have a follow-up event on the 3rd of November. So this is our message. Action on both carbon and nitrogen is needed to get to net zero. The UNEA resolution, which I haven't said about, but you can Google that as well, and the Colombo Declaration are key starting points for taking action in the UN system. Halving nitrogen waste is offering, we estimate, a global goal worth $100 billion a year, and that's just the fertilizer value, in addition to the societal value for health and economy and environment. And really, we're saying that if we transform the nitrogen cycle to get that nitrous oxide, to get the other win-wins, that means it's really a multiple benefit equation. And it's those multiple benefits which we think is really going to help accelerate action. And so with that, handing back to you.
Thank you, Mark. That was really, really informative. And I really like the approach of focusing on things where you're not going to get an immediate pushback, so that there is, room for dialogue and room for positive steps to come forward. But it is worrying still to see the trending upwards all the time. So we really do need to take action. Just a quick reminder to pop your questions into the Q&A, and then we will move to our final speaker of this session, who is Professor Sami Ullah from the University of Birmingham, where he is a professor of biogeochemistry. Sami's research is mainly focused on the linkages between carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus cycling under global change in soils. The impetus of his research is to advance mechanistic understanding of the response of microbial functions such as denitrification, nitrogen and carbon mineralization, greenhouse gas fluxes and soil enzyme activity to land use and climate change at catchment scale. He's going to tell us about these interactions in land management and his current experiments in carbon dioxide enrichment. Over to you, Sami. We see your slides now. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, Iseult. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you as well, Sami.
So I cannot turn on my video. That's with the admin team there to turn it on.
Okay. Yeah.
Nice.
There we are. We see you now as well. Super. Perfect.
Thank you for the invitations and glad to be here. I will cover bits of terrestrial carbon stores in the global landscapes, and then with my presentations, I would steer it towards forests and forest response to atmospheric fertilizations by elevated carbon dioxide. So of course, it's a very huge area and discipline. So I'm just touching on a few of the key areas, and then happy to discuss further or answer questions in relation to carbon stores in terrestrial ecosystems. So here we show the total soil organic carbon stocks in the upper 1 meter are about 1800 petagrams of carbon. The same stocks in the upper 2 meters outside is about 3000 petagram of carbon. Soil inorganic carbon stocks are about 940 petagrams of carbon. I'm not touching more on the inorganic carbon stocks, but if there are any questions or questions in relation to the threats to this carbon pool, so I could explain further. And the soil carbon stocks are way larger than the atmospheric carbon pool. However, we have lost a lot of soil carbon stocks, mainly by converting natural ecosystems to agricultural production systems. So you could see when you convert these ecosystems for the production systems, the drainage and ditching and ploughing and working out of the soils eventually enhances decompositions to remove the stored soil carbon. And that's what happened. And if we look globally, how much we have lost since humans started cultivating the land. So this figure is showing thousands of years of history of human habitations in terms of used land area on the y-axis. And then the cumulative soil organic carbon losses on the right side and the y-axis in petagrams of carbon over the 2 meter depth of soil globally. So as the area under grazing in croplands increased, and so did the soil organic carbon stocks. Currently 133 petagrams of carbon being lost from the soil pool globally up to 2 meter depth. If we consider only 1 meter depth, then that's about 75 petagrams of carbon being lost. And that probably speaks of the potential how much we could pull back into the soil, knowing how much we have lost through these hundreds of years. So once we converted the natural ecosystems to produce food, it also not only led to the loss of the carbon in the soil, but also we came up with additional stressors for the atmospheric burden of global warming in case of nitrous oxide here. This figure shows the in this light yellow color, the global distribution of organic soils. And so this is a study we conducted globally using the same experimental protocols to measure nitrous oxide emissions from organic soils drained and used for agriculture against undrained in natural organic soil systems. Overall, this study demonstrates, and the round dot shows the amount of N2O fluxes in microgram of nitrogen per meter square per hour. Overall, it shows that as we increase the emissions of nitrous oxide, as we increase the drainage and fertilization of these organic soils, we see an increase in N2O emissions because Mark and Joann talked about N2O, so I'm not going to spend more time here, but it just showed that not only we lost the carbon, but we enhanced the emission of N2O into the air as well. So the challenges in agriculture catchments is thus what we could do to really look for alternative husbandry of climate resilient agriculture systems and to be able to produce food sustainably. Again, we need to build soil carbon, and there are various recommendations, including the 4 per mil initiative, which is 4 per thousand or 0.4% of carbon to be captured back in agriculture systems to alternative soil husbandry practices. So there are these different ways of approaches, local actions to regional to international actions to really capture back the carbon that we lost into the air from the soil carbon stocks. Among these measures, there are calls for the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions that the previous speakers talked about, both nitrous oxide and methane. And because agriculture in our catchment is part of our mixed land use systems where we have forestry and peat systems, so there are also calls for conserving and restoring natural ecosystems, forest peat or agroforestry to really diversify the landscapes, capture the carbon more in soils and improve the overall health of our catchments. Now I mentioned forests, so in carbon capture, so if we look into the global carbon capture by the land plots, that's about 1/3 of the total CO2 emissions of human sources that goes up into the air. So that's a substantial potential that we have on land capture the emitted CO2 back into the soil and biomass carbon pools. And amongst the land carbon pools, northern hemisphere forest absorbs 3 petagrams of carbon dioxide, and within those forests, temperate forests, absorbs about almost like 1 petagram of carbon into biomass and eventually the soil carbon stock. So this uptake pretty much equates to the total EU 27 nations emissions of carbon dioxide from anthropogenic sources. And this is equivalent of roughly the amount of CO2 being emitted into a year from the global deforestation. So the northern hemisphere forests have substantial potential to capture, and they do capture a lot of carbon. The question is how long these forests will sustain such an uptake. And because the atmospheric CO2 concentration is increasing, so will these forests be able to capture more and more carbon as we see an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations? To answer these questions, the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research established a 3-year carbon enrichment experiment, which is one of the world's 3 largest climate change experiments. We have 3 ambient phase rings and 3 treatments where we raise the CO2 from dawn to dusk on top of the ambient by 150 ppm, so that we could see the response of the trees and the whole ecosystems out in the field to this fertilizing effects that is expected by 2050, the concentration of CO2 by that time. And the experiment started by 2017. It's going to run up to 2027, and we have ambitions to even go beyond a decade because ecological processes takes longer to reach, to change and respond to these changes. I don't have time to go to further details or much of the results, but a lot of researchers are engaged. But one key outcome recently published out of this work is that the oak trees in the upper canopy responded to these CO2 fumigations consistently and took up to 1/3 more CO2 under these elevated CO2 concentrations. We have further studies underway tracking and evaluating if this CO2 uptake might be limited by nutrients, water, or diseases in future and how long we could sustain. So this area will be generating further research to really support the forecast for carbon uptakes by northern temperate forests. Again, I come back to key points, which is just an amalgamations of a few things. We lost substantial carbon stocks, and there is a scope really to in the catchments to enhance soil carbon stores in agriculture, improve soil health for sustainable production, reduce greenhouse gas emission, restore and conserve natural ecosystems. And as Mark fully elaborated on the actions, so these could be local, national, regional, and global actions from policy, finances, scientific study, public engagement, and responsible living choices to really make it happen. So thank you for your time, and we'll be happy to discuss any points that you may have.
Very many thanks, Sami. That's the BIFOR experiment is just absolutely fascinating. Can I invite you all to turn back on your cameras, and I will thank you all once again for the great introductions to the range and breadth of contributions from agriculture to climate change. Each of you have suggested already some potential actions and strategies for mitigating this. So can I just ask you, and I'll come to you one by one, what you would individually like to see coming out of COP26 related to your own area of work. So Michelle, maybe I'll come to you first. What would you really like to see coming out of COP26?
Well, that's a massive question. I think some solid commitments to taking action in the very near future, so in the immediate future, because longer term targets, yes, everyone can agree to those and aspire to them, but what we really need is the actual action. So more concrete plans for we will ban this or that or transition to not, so some of the things that the UK government has started to do now with the heating document they released yesterday, for example. So I think those kinds of elements would be really useful, so then we can actually analyse the actual numbers. Okay, if they achieve these specific goals, how far is that going to get us?
Yeah, and I guess then the quantification of that and how we would actually track progress towards it is critical. Joann, what would you like to see coming out of COP26?
Yeah, I think something along the same lines in terms of also rewarding people who are taking the best actions. We have in North America a few carbon credit programs, and so there's quite a bit of interest to look at what is happening in the agriculture sector and see which producers, for instance, are adopting better nitrogen management practices and quantify that, in fact, they do have reductions in the N2O emissions and give them a sort of carbon credit for that. So that type of program, which a government can set up and I think oversee quite efficiently, and have people through voluntary means, but with economic rewards, I think it could be a very productive way to move forward.
Super. Mark?
Yeah, I think it builds on what I said in my presentation. We've said from a hashtag perspective that nitrogen is everywhere and invisible. And it's the kind of thing that is there, you look across the Sustainable Development Goals and you will struggle to find the word nitrogen existing in that. And yet nitrogen is underpinning so many of the different things. I think for COP, I would love to see nitrogen becoming visible. It's a feeling so far over the years that ammonia has been the Cinderella of air pollution. And I think you could say that nitrous oxide is the Cinderella of climate mitigation. So I would love to see countries taking action, recognizing that it's not just about pain and say, oh, we don't want to touch nitrous oxide, it's all too difficult, but turn it around and say, actually, let's embrace this because it's an opportunity for us. The nitrogen front is surely not going to lead to a substantial negotiation agreement this time round, but what I would love to see is that they embrace it, ready for the years ahead.
Okay, super. Sami.
So I agree with what the panel members said, and I will just add a few more points. Governments really need to decide the living styles in the way we live, the way we wear clothes, and everything to reduce the burden on our environment if we have to fight the climate change. And at the same time, the natural ecosystems in their responses to climate change would take decades and centuries. And so also if nations agree to invest more in the science of climate change so that more credible and varied policies could be produced in the run-up to mitigations and adaptations.
Super. That actually brings me nicely to my next question for you, which is related to the fact that many of the audience watching this and who will watch it on the YouTube channel later are students. So what do you think are the aspects of chemistry and environmental science that would be particularly useful for students to engage with, to prepare for future careers in climate mitigation and particularly climate mitigation from agriculture? Any of you would like to tackle that one? Mark, please.
Yeah, I think the thing that struck me as I've worked on this is I started life as an undergraduate in botany, having thought about being a geologist, doing a PhD in a forestry department funded by an atmospheric chemistry program and apparently doing environmental physics. And the more I go through these things, the more I find out that we have to be ready to cross disciplines, not be afraid of the other disciplines, work with colleagues that are experts. So for young scientists, I would encourage you, don't be afraid to look at just chemistry on its own, but look at the links with other disciplines.
Super. Michelle, you want to add anything?
Well, so, I mean, I'm not a chemist by training, although I did work in the chemistry department for many years. And I'd agree with that, really, because we all have to work together to build the models to understand all these physical, environmental processes and biological now as well. So, all the different disciplines in science and computing and mathematics, they're all completely coming together, really, and we're all having to work with colleagues who have those complementary expertises, really. So whatever you're interested in, there's probably a chemistry angle to it, whichever aspect of climate mitigation you're thinking about.
Super. Joann, I was fascinated to see the chemical structures of some of the toxins that you presented from the algal blooms, and the fascinating link now to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all sorts of things. So it really does just show it all comes back to the chemistry and the molecules themselves, that we need to understand how they're formed and where they're going and what they're doing. So.
You're absolutely right, Iseult. You know, that's the thing. It's all linked together, and you can never imagine how something as simple as some phosphorus leaving an agricultural field could fuel all of these, you know, downstream and very wicked problems with unexpected consequences. So that's the thing. Chemistry really is everywhere, and it's a very exciting time for young folks to be involved in it. A lot of the things that we were doing personally with those cyanotoxins, we've only had the capacity, analytical capacity, within the past 5 years or so to really get down, drill down, and detect the very trace amounts that are in many of our systems. So there's lots of exciting times ahead, I do believe.
Super. And it's great that you mentioned the analytical aspects as well, because there's huge scope for development of new detection methods, new sensors, new methodologies as well. So Sami, I'll give the last word to you, because I'm conscious that we've used up our time. So anything else you'd like to add to inspire students?
Yeah, it's about agriculture and climate change, and because agriculture mainly relies on soils, and the discipline of soil or soil science, soil chemistry, soil biology is not, I think it needs more people in that discipline, because we have to have skills in those disciplines, in soil chemistry, in soil biology, in soil physics, to be able to manage soils sustainably, both for our food production and climate change mitigations and flood protections and all the associated functions that the soils deliver. So it's an ignored component of our environment, and it needs fresh hands and fresh minds. So I would encourage the next generations to come and be engaged in soils more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you once again to all of our panelists. I've learned a huge amount today, and I've found it absolutely fascinating. You can also find more Royal Society of Chemistry discussions around the UN's COP26 programme on the Royal Society of Chemistry website, which is at rsc.li/COP26, or on our social media channels. Please do join us for further webinars in this series, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Iseult.
Bye-bye.
Super.
The chemical sciences are at the heart of sustainability solutions. Sustainability, powered by chemistry.